When seasoned pilot David Roberts boards a flight as just another passenger, he's met with casual prejudice from the crew and fellow travelers. But when a medical emergency leaves the aircraft without a captain mid-flight, David must step up to save the passengers who had underestimated him. With lives hanging in the balance, will the man they ignored become their only hope? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. David Roberts stepped onto the aircraft, blending in effortlessly with the bustling crowd. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall and composed, with a quiet demeanor that often made him invisible to the world around him. He wore comfortable jeans and a plain gray hoodie, the hood pulled back to reveal a neatly trimmed beard and dark, intelligent eyes. The flight wasn't long, a routine domestic journey to visit his parents after months of back-to-back flights. David, a seasoned pilot with thousands of hours in the cockpit, finally had time to just be David, not Captain Roberts. Dragging a small carry-on behind him, David made his way through the narrow aisle, scanning his ticket for the seat number. As he reached the overhead compartment, he tried to lift his bag into the storage space. It was a little tight, and with one hand occupied, he couldn't quite angle it correctly. He turned to a passing flight attendant, a woman with perfectly set blonde hair and a polished uniform. "Excuse me, could I get some help here?" David asked politely, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The attendant, whose name tag read Amy, gave him a fleeting glance, brief but cold. Her lips tightened with annoyance. "It's not that heavy," she said dismissively, as if his request were beneath her. She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked toward a passenger seated in first class. David's smile faded, though he didn't react outwardly. He sighed quietly, adjusting the bag himself. He wasn't unfamiliar with such treatment. It was the kind of everyday slight that never seemed to end. As he got the bag into place and sat down in his window seat, he noticed a few passengers had seen the exchange. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't noticed. David shook his head, forcing himself to let it go. These moments were always fleeting, he reminded himself, but they left a sting all the same. He adjusted his headphones around his neck, gazing out the window as more passengers boarded. The seats began filling quickly. Across the aisle sat an older white woman with perfectly curled silver hair and an air of superiority. As David made eye contact with her, she gave him a once-over, her nose wrinkling ever so slightly, as if he were something unpleasant. David turned his gaze back to the window, accustomed to such silent judgments. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the flight deck crew was finishing preparations. Captain Tom McAllister leaned back in his seat, flipping through the flight checklist. His co-pilot, Susan Jennings, a petite, focused woman in her early 40s, reviewed the weather reports on her tablet. "Smooth ride today," Captain McAllister said with a grin, stretching his legs. Susan glanced at the passenger list out of habit, not noticing anything unusual. "Let's hope it stays that way," she replied, returning the grin. Neither of them knew that in a few hours the ordinary flight would be anything but routine, and that a stranger sitting among the passengers would have the power to save them all. David settled in, feeling the plane's engines hum to life beneath his seat. He closed his eyes, hoping for a peaceful journey, unaware of the storm quietly brewing both inside and outside the plane. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began to relax. Some took out books and magazines, others plugged in their earbuds or opened their laptops. David leaned back in his seat, his eyes drifting to the clouds outside the window. A few minutes later, flight attendants began the beverage service, wheeling the cart down the narrow aisle. David sat quietly, watching as they cheerfully attended to the passengers around him. "Would you like coffee or tea, sir?" Amy, the same flight attendant who had dismissed David earlier, asked a man seated 2 rows ahead. He was white, wearing an expensive-looking business suit, and she greeted him with a smile that could have been mistaken for genuine warmth. David's turn came, but instead of acknowledging him, Amy wheeled the cart right past his row without a glance. The subtle snub made David's jaw tighten, but he stayed silent. He knew how these moments could escalate if he so much as questioned her behavior. Across the aisle, the older woman with silver hair, the one David had noticed earlier, turned toward him, an expression of mild distaste on her face. "I've noticed," she began in a conspiratorial whisper, "that certain people these days expect special treatment." She gave him a pointed look, her voice carrying an air of unearned superiority. David exhaled slowly, suppressing the urge to engage. Years of navigating moments like these had taught him that nothing good came from confrontation. He gave her a polite, distant smile, the kind designed to deflect further conversation. She looked satisfied, as though she had made some profound point, and returned to stirring the lemon in her tea with delicate fingers. David adjusted his position in his seat, trying to focus on the hum of the engines rather than the unpleasantness unfolding around him. The steady rhythm of the flight was something that usually calmed him, a reminder of the skies he knew so well, of the cockpit where he was in control. But being a passenger was different. Here, he was just another face, and assumptions about him seemed to float like invisible currents in the air. Not everyone ignored him, though. A younger flight attendant named Sarah passed by, her eyes lingering briefly on David. She offered him a small, apologetic smile, not enough to undo what had happened, but enough to show she noticed. It was the look of someone caught between wanting to do the right thing and fearing the consequences of stepping out of line. David appreciated the gesture, but it also saddened him. People saw the injustice, but rarely acted. A low rumble of turbulence made the plane shudder, and David's fingers curled around the armrests instinctively. To anyone else, it might have felt like a harmless bump, but to a seasoned pilot like David, it hinted at unsettled air ahead. He glanced around. Most passengers seemed unconcerned, chatting or scrolling through their phones. A few minutes passed, and David flagged down Amy as she passed by again with the cart. "Could I get some water, please?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and polite. Amy gave him a quick, disinterested glance. "We'll get to you soon," she said curtly, and continued down the aisle without breaking her stride. David clenched his jaw, the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. It wasn't about the water, it was about being treated like he didn't matter, like he was invisible. The turbulence hit again, harder this time. A sudden jolt made passengers gasp, and overhead bins rattled loudly. David knew immediately that the aircraft had entered unstable air. The plane settled briefly, but the calm didn't last long. A garbled announcement crackled over the intercom. "This is your co-pilot speaking. We are experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." David's instincts kicked in, sensing something off in the co-pilot's tone. He sat up straighter, scanning the faces of the flight attendants and other passengers. He could tell they were feeling the shift too. The subtle unease that spreads when something isn't right, but no one wants to acknowledge it yet. "More turbulence? I hope they know what they're doing up there," muttered Elizabeth Johnson, the older woman across the aisle, clutching the armrests dramatically. David shot her a sidelong glance, debating whether to reassure her. Before he could decide, the plane gave another sudden lurch, and several passengers yelped in surprise. It wasn't just regular turbulence, this was something more serious. Then, the cabin lights flickered briefly, and a hush fell over the passengers. David could feel it now. Something was definitely wrong. A moment later, the co-pilot's voice came over the intercom again, but this time it wasn't a routine announcement. There was a tremor in her words that set David on edge. "Ladies and gentlemen," Susan's voice wavered slightly, "we're dealing with a situation in the cockpit. Captain McAllister has fallen ill, and I'm currently managing things alone. We're asking if there's anyone on board with flying experience who could assist us. Please press the call button if you can help." The announcement sent a ripple of panic through the cabin. Passengers exchanged anxious glances, and the flight attendants whispered urgently to one another, clearly unprepared for an emergency of this magnitude. David's heart raced. He had flown dozens of aircraft and faced countless emergencies in the air, but this was different. He wasn't in the captain's seat this time. No uniform, no authority, just a passenger surrounded by people who had already judged him without knowing who he was. He stared at the overhead call button, his mind swirling. All he had to do was press it. His training, his experience, it could save them all. But the hesitation crept in like a shadow. He thought of Amy's dismissive glances, of Elizabeth's sneering comments, and of how people had treated him his entire life. Would they even believe him? Would they trust him to take control, or would they dismiss him again? The plane jolted violently, yanking David from his thoughts. Luggage shifted in the overhead bins, and a baby wailed from the back of the cabin. Fear gripped the passengers now, playing on their faces. David knew the plane wouldn't wait for his doubts to resolve. The time for second-guessing was gone. He looked around one last time, the passengers, the flight attendants, all of them too scared to act. And then he made his decision. David reached up and pressed the call button. A moment later, Sarah, the Kinder flight attendant, arrived. Her eyes widened as she recognized him. "Yes?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. David kept his tone steady and calm. "I'm a pilot," he said. "I can help." Sarah's eyes flickered with surprise, then something close to relief. But she hesitated, glancing toward Amy, who was standing further down the aisle with an expression of disbelief on her face. "Are you sure?" Sarah whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Yes," David said firmly. "I've flown commercial jets for years. I can help land this plane." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, caught between disbelief and hope. And then with a nod, she turned and motioned for him to follow her toward the front of the plane. David stood, feeling every eye in the cabin on him as he walked down the aisle. He knew what they were thinking. Who is this guy? What is he doing? But he didn't care anymore. He was going to do what needed to be done. Because when the skies get rough, you don't wait for approval. You take control. David followed Sarah toward the cockpit, his heart steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. The narrow aisle felt longer than usual, with passengers craning their necks and murmuring in confusion. As he approached the front, Amy crossed her arms and glared at him, her expression a mixture of skepticism and annoyance. "You said you're a pilot?" she asked, her tone doubtful, as if the idea of David flying a plane was somehow absurd. "Yes," David replied without missing a beat. "Commercial experience. I need to get in there now." Sarah gave Amy a sharp glance. "He's our only option, Amy. You heard Susan. She's alone up there." Amy hesitated for a moment longer, but the urgency in Sarah's voice forced her to step aside reluctantly. She clearly wasn't happy about it, her lips pursed as if she were sucking on a lemon. David didn't care. He had no time to spare for her misplaced judgment. As the cockpit door opened, David stepped inside and found Susan Jennings in the captain's seat, her hands trembling slightly on the controls. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and relief as she saw David. "You're the help they sent?" she asked, still catching her breath. Sweat glistened on her forehead, and the strain of managing the aircraft alone was evident. "Yes," David said, slipping into the co-pilot's seat with practiced ease. He quickly scanned the instruments, his brain falling into familiar rhythms. The autopilot was engaged, but the plane was flying through rough air, bouncing slightly with every gust of turbulence. "What happened to McAllister?" David asked, referring to the captain. He collapsed out of nowhere." Susan glanced toward the captain's seat, where McAllister lay slumped, unconscious and pale. He was complaining of chest pains, and then he just went down. "I called the medics on the ground, but we're not sure what's going on." David gave a grim nod. "Okay, first things first, we need to stabilize this plane." Susan shot him a cautious look. "What's your experience?" David tapped a few switches, adjusting the altitude settings. 15 years flying commercial. I've handled worse." His voice was calm, but there was an unshakable confidence in it that made Susan exhale slightly, some of her tension easing. "All right," she said, relinquishing some of the control. "I'm glad you're here. We're diverting to the nearest airport. Air traffic control has cleared a path for us, but they need us to start descending soon." David nodded and reached for the radio. "I'll handle communication. You keep an eye on McAllister." Susan shifted her focus to the captain, checking his pulse and propping him into a safer position. David, meanwhile, adjusted the plane's trajectory, his hands moving swiftly over the controls like a pianist playing a well-rehearsed symphony. "Mayday, Mayday," David spoke into the radio, his voice smooth and steady. "This is Flight 328. Captain McAllister is incapacitated. I have taken control of the aircraft, requesting priority landing clearance at the nearest airport. The air traffic controller responded immediately. Roger that, Flight 328. Redirecting you to Logan International Airport. You are cleared for an emergency descent. Maintain heading 245 degrees and descend to 10,000 feet. David repeated the instructions, adjusting the settings and slowly beginning the descent. The plane responded smoothly to his commands, as if recognizing a familiar hand at the helm. Back in the cabin, the tension was palpable. The passengers could feel the gradual descent and exchanged worried glances. Elizabeth Johnson, the older woman seated near David earlier, clutched her handbag tightly, her lips pursed in nervous disapproval. "What's going on? Are we crashing?" she whispered to a man seated beside her. Amy and the other flight attendants moved through the aisles, trying to calm everyone. "Please remain seated," Amy instructed, though her voice lacked the warmth of genuine concern. "Everything is under control." But it wasn't enough to ease the passengers' fears. They had heard the co-pilot's earlier announcement about the captain's illness, and the absence of any updates only made things worse. Elizabeth leaned toward a fellow passenger and muttered, "I saw that man go into the cockpit. Can you believe that? Him? Are we seriously trusting him to fly this plane?" Her words spread like wildfire through the cabin, fueling the unease. Amy overheard the comment but said nothing. She, too, had doubts, though she kept them to herself. In the cockpit, David and Susan worked seamlessly, their focus entirely on the task at hand. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, causing it to lurch again, but David corrected it smoothly, keeping everything under control. "Logan Tower, this is Flight 328 on final approach," David radioed. "Preparing for emergency landing. Flight 328, you are cleared for runway 27. Emergency services are standing by." David glanced at Susan, who gave him a quick nod. "Landing gear deployed," she confirmed, her voice steadier now. David's hands tightened slightly on the yoke as the runway came into view, stretching out beneath them like a lifeline. The passengers behind the cockpit door had no idea that a pilot they had dismissed without a second thought was now guiding them to safety. The wind pushed against the plane as they descended, but David adjusted effortlessly, compensating for the crosswind with a slight tilt of the wings. Susan stole a glance at him, her respect for this stranger growing with every passing second. "Brace for landing," David said calmly over the intercom. In the cabin, passengers tensed, clutching their armrests and each other. The air seemed to vibrate with unspoken fear. Elizabeth Johnson crossed herself, muttering a prayer under her breath. For the first time since the flight began, no one seemed concerned with status or appearances. They were united in fear, waiting for the ground to meet them. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud, and the plane roared as David deployed the reverse thrust. The aircraft shuddered as it slowed on the runway, but everything remained under control. "Welcome to Logan International," David announced over the intercom, his voice calm. "We've made it." The cabin erupted in applause, nervous, grateful, and unaware of the man who had just saved their lives. David leaned back in the seat, exhaling deeply for the first time since taking over. Susan looked at him, a tired but sincere smile spreading across her face. "Not bad," she said with a chuckle. David allowed himself a small grin. Not bad at all. As emergency crews approached the aircraft, David knew his job was done. But he also knew that recognition or praise wouldn't follow. He didn't need it. He was just a man doing what needed to be done. "Let's get these people off the plane," Susan said, glancing toward the cabin door. David nodded. There was still a long way to go, but for now they had made it through the storm. The aircraft had come to a halt, and emergency vehicles surrounded the plane like ants swarming a leaf. Bright red and blue lights flashed outside, casting an eerie glow across the runway as firefighters and paramedics rushed toward the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Susan unbuckled her seatbelt, releasing a long-held breath. David leaned back, rubbing his palms together, his adrenaline finally starting to wear off. He could hear the muffled cheers and applause from the passengers filtering through the cockpit door. They had no idea who had flown them to safety. They only knew that they were alive. And that was enough for David. Susan gave him a nod of respect. "I don't know how you stayed so calm, but thank you. We wouldn't have made it without you." David shrugged, a modest smile on his face. Just doing what I was trained to do. A quick knock at the cockpit door startled them. Sarah peeked in, her expression one of cautious gratitude. The paramedics are on their way to help Captain McAllister, she informed them. They'll also need to speak with both of you. David nodded. Let them know I'll be right behind you. Susan stood and stretched, glancing toward David one last time. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken apology for whatever assumptions she might have made earlier. I mean it, she said quietly. Thank you. Then she disappeared into the chaos outside the cockpit, leaving David alone for a moment. He sat in the stillness, listening to the hum of the now quiet engines. The weight of the last few hours settled heavily on his shoulders. Just a few hours ago, he had been nothing more than another passenger. A man overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. Now he had saved over 100 lives, though he knew few would recognize that fact. And strangely, that didn't bother him. In the cabin, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful as the passengers waited to disembark. Most were on their phones, texting loved ones, posting updates, or simply sitting in stunned silence. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, helping passengers gather their belongings while trying to maintain some semblance of order. Elizabeth Johnson, the older woman with silver curls, was still seated stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly around the handles of her handbag. Her eyes darted anxiously toward the front of the plane, where David had entered the cockpit earlier. I still can't believe they let him fly the plane, she muttered, speaking more to herself than anyone else. The man beside her, a middle-aged businessman, raised an eyebrow. Well, he did land us safely, he pointed out. Elizabeth scoffed, though the fear lingering in her eyes betrayed her bravado. Lucky, that's all. Just lucky. A few rows away, Sarah finished helping an elderly couple collect their bags. She noticed David emerging from the cockpit, his expression weary but composed. She felt a pang of guilt deep in her chest. He had saved them all, and yet he would probably walk off this plane without so much as a thank you from most of the passengers. David stepped into the main cabin, immediately aware of the shift in energy. Heads turned as he passed, and he could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes. Some looked curious, others puzzled. A few, like Elizabeth, still wore expressions of disbelief, but no one spoke directly to him. Amy stood near the exit, looking uncomfortable as David approached. Her lips pressed together tightly, and her gaze flicked nervously between David and the passengers. It was clear that she now realized what had happened, and that she regretted how she had treated him earlier. David stopped in front of her, meeting her gaze with calm, steady eyes. For a moment, Amy seemed as if she might say something, a word of apology perhaps, but the words never came. Instead, she gave him a stiff, awkward nod, and quickly looked away, pretending to busy herself with checking the overhead compartments. Sarah, standing nearby, gave David a small, meaningful smile. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. David returned the smile, appreciating the gesture, even though it felt bittersweet. The passengers began disembarking in small groups, filing off the plane and into the terminal, where paramedics, airport staff, and reporters were waiting. David stayed behind for a moment, letting the others go ahead. He didn't need to be the first out. He didn't need recognition or applause. As he made his way toward the exit, Elizabeth Johnson crossed his path. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, her confident, superior demeanor faltered. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might say something, but instead she gave him a curt nod, an awkward, half-hearted acknowledgement. David nodded back, the slightest flicker of amusement crossing his face. He wasn't expecting a thank you from her, and he certainly didn't need it. But it was amusing to watch her struggle with the realization that the man she had looked down upon had saved her life. When David stepped into the terminal, the cool rush of air-conditioned airport air greeted him. Susan was waiting near the gate, talking with airport officials and giving a brief report to the paramedics. She spotted David and waved him over. You okay? She asked as he approached. David nodded. Yeah, just glad it's over. Susan gave him a grateful smile. They want to give you some kind of formal recognition, you know, maybe even put out a press release. David shook his head. That won't be necessary. Susan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. You sure? After everything you did? I think people should know." David smiled faintly, his expression thoughtful. "That's kind of the point, isn't it? Doing the right thing doesn't need an audience." Susan stared at him for a moment, then gave him a small, respectful nod. "Well, if you ever need anything at all, you've got my number." David gave her a grateful nod and turned toward the terminal's exit. As David walked through the airport, the events of the day played back in his mind. The judgments, the small slights, the assumptions people had made about him. None of it mattered now. He had done what needed to be done. And in the end, that was enough. He pulled out his phone and texted his parents to let them know he had landed safely. His mother responded almost immediately. "Can't wait to see you. Your father has the grill going already." David smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The day had been long, and the journey had been unexpected, but he was exactly where he needed to be, heading home. He exited the airport and stepped into the cool evening air. The sky above was clear, the stars just beginning to peek through the fading light. For a moment, David stood still, breathing deeply and letting the weight of the day dissolve into the night. Then, with a final glance toward the airport behind him, David slipped his hands into his pockets and walked toward the waiting car. It had been a flight he would never forget, but now it was behind him, and the road ahead was open, wide, and full of possibility. David watched as the taxi pulled away from the curb, leaving him at the front of his parents' modest home. The familiar scent of grilled chicken and freshly cut grass welcomed him before he even reached the front door. The place hadn't changed much since he'd been away. Same porch swing, same potted plants that his mom cared for like children. It felt good to be home, to slip back into a place where he wasn't judged by the color of his skin or dismissed with glances. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and his mother pulled him into a tight hug. "Oh, my baby," she cried, squeezing him as if he might vanish if she let go. "You didn't tell us your flight was going to be late." "I was about to send the National Guard after you," David chuckled softly, hugging her back. "Sorry, Ma. Long day, some unexpected turbulence." His father, a tall, stocky man with a graying beard, appeared behind her, flipping a kitchen towel over his shoulder. "Well, you're here now, and that's all that matters. Come on, your mother's been fretting about those wings on the grill for the past hour." David grinned, grateful for the normalcy. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The evening passed comfortably, filled with laughter, stories, and the familiar rhythms of family. But despite the warmth, David's mind kept drifting back to the events of the flight. As much as he tried to shake it off, the faces of the passengers and crew lingered. The subtle judgments, the fear, the moment when everything had rested on his shoulders. He thought about Amy's awkward nod, about Elizabeth Johnson's barely concealed discomfort, and how none of them knew the full story. Yet it didn't matter. He hadn't done it for them. He'd done it because in the end, doing the right thing was the only thing that mattered. 2 days later, David sat in his parents' living room, scrolling through the news on his phone. His flight had made the local headlines, though the story was sanitized and vague. Flight 328-8 makes emergency landing after captain falls ill. The article mentioned the swift actions of the crew, credited Susan Jennings for her composure, and briefly noted that a passenger with flight experience had assisted with the landing. David wasn't surprised by the omission of his name. It was exactly as he'd expected. What did surprise him, though, was a follow-up article featuring an interview with Amy, the flight attendant who had ignored him during the flight. In the interview, she praised the professionalism of the mysterious passenger who had helped land the plane. Her words were polite, calculated, carefully avoiding any mention of her earlier behavior. But David could read between the lines. She was grateful, but she didn't want to face the truth of her actions that day. The karma of the situation had hit her hard, but she wasn't ready to confront it. David let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. People had a funny way of rewriting events to fit their own narratives. But that was okay. He didn't need their apology. Karma had already done its work. A few hours later, David's phone buzzed with a message from Susan Jennings. "Susan. Hey, just wanted to say thanks again. I know you didn't want recognition, but I've been telling everyone who'll listen about what you did. If you ever need a co-pilot, you know who to call." David smiled, typing a quick reply. David. Thanks, Susan. You did great up there. I was just the extra set of hands. She responded almost instantly. Modest, too. Pilots like you are rare these days. David chuckled, shaking his head. It was strange how things turned out, how people who had doubted him were now offering respect, if not outright apologies. But the funny thing about respect, he thought, was that it often came too late, offered only after it was clear the person deserved it all along. That evening, David went for a walk, the sky overhead painted in soft shades of orange and purple as the sun set. He thought about the flight again, not with bitterness, but with quiet reflection. He realized something important in those moments, something he had known deep down but hadn't fully accepted until now. People's assumptions, judgments, and prejudices would always exist. There would always be someone like Elizabeth, someone like Amy. And he could spend his life trying to fight against it, or let it weigh him down. Or he could keep flying, keep doing what he was meant to do, regardless of how the world saw him. He paused at the edge of a small park, watching children play on a nearby playground. The sounds of laughter and joy filled the air, untarnished by the biases that plagued the adult world. He smiled to himself, a sense of peace settling over him. He had made it through another storm, both in the air and on the ground. And as long as he stayed true to who he was, nothing else really mattered. The next morning, David booked a flight back to the city where he was based. As he boarded the plane, he noticed the flight crew giving him polite, respectful smiles. They had no idea who he was, of course, just another passenger on another flight. But this time, it didn't bother him. He found his seat, placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment without trouble, and settled in by the window. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off, David watched the world shrink beneath him, the cities and roads turning into tiny dots on the landscape. Up here, above the clouds, everything was equal. The skies didn't care about skin color, status, or appearances. Up here, it was just about skill, courage, and staying steady under pressure. David closed his eyes, the hum of the engines lulling him into a calm state of mind. He knew that when he landed, life would go on as usual. Some people would judge him by his appearance before knowing anything about him. Others would underestimate him, just as they always had. But none of that mattered, because David Roberts knew who he was, and the skies would always be his. Free, open, and limitless. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.